Good evening, and welcome back to Beyond Death's Gate. Today's story is about a man named John Scholl and how he became a disciple of death. John Scholl was a young, troubled man. He had lost his mother when he was 5, and his father when he was 12. At the age of 15, he had snuck onto a ship that he thought was being used for transporting cargo. It was soon after the ship left the bay that he realized the ship he had boarded was indeed not a cargo ship, but rather belonged to a crew of pirates, and most of the goods on the ship were actually stolen valuables rather than common transport goods. After realizing this, he decided to stay hidden until the ship went back to shore and sneak back off the ship the same way he got on. For 3 days, the ship stayed on the sea, never going anywhere near shore. Where could the ship possibly be going? John had thought to himself. And it was on the 4th day that John decided to try and explore some parts of the ship. Over the previous 3 days on board, he had begun to know some of the more common walking paths of the crew members, and had even seen some of them from behind. Currently, he was in a below-deck storage area. The only crew member that really came back here was the one he had seen before. John assumed it was the ship's quartermaster. It was about 4 a.m. when John had decided to explore the ship. The door that the quartermaster used wasn't locked, so he decided to use that one. Slowly, John opened the door to peek around to the other side. Just as he had thought, it was what appeared to be a kitchen area. A large table in the middle of the room with various stains covering it, most of them seemingly red in color. There was a wash bin with dishes against the wall, and various kitchen utensils hanging on the wall nearby. To his left was a wall with a single window, and to his right was another door. There were no sounds of movement coming from the other side, so John decided to open the door. This time, he was looking at a larger room. A large table lined with chairs was in the center of the room. Must have been a dining area, thought John. As John snuck through the dining area, being careful to avoid making too much noise, he heard a sound. It was the sound of someone moving above him. He assumed it was a lookout moving around on the upper deck. At the end of the room was a stairwell that led up, and a door next to it with a sign hanging over the top reading, "Crew Quarters." As he got closer, he could hear the faint sound of some of the crew members snoring on the other side of the door, but no movement could be heard. John slowly made his way towards the stairs and was cautious going up them in fear of waking the crew members that were next door. Upon reaching the door, he very carefully, as to not make a single sound, creeped the door open. He was finally at the deck of the ship, the smell of salt water from the ocean hitting him like a tidal wave, causing him to become slightly nauseous. It was dark out, with the only light being from the stars and the moon that shone brightly above. The deck was barren of any life from what John could see. No movement was seen, and no sounds were heard other than the lapping of the waves hitting the side of the ship, and the creaking of the ship as it rocked on the water. He stood for a moment, embracing the quiet of the night, when he heard a faint noise from above. On the upper platform where the ship's wheel was, the noise he heard was of heavy footsteps walking along the boards, followed by a conversation between two unknown persons.
"We still on course to the island?"
The rough, gravelly voice asked, piercing the silence.
Of course, Captain. Everything's going to plan. We're still on course to arrive in 3 days.
Replied a slightly younger, less haggard voice. John assumed this was the ship's navigator. He once again heard what he now knew was the captain.
"Good. We don't want to miss the festivities after all."
And this was followed by a light-hearted chuckle by the navigator.
Suppose you're right, sir. Much to do once we get there. I'll get with Juno in the morning to see what supplies we'll need once we land.
No, you're quite alright. I'll go down myself and see what we'll need. You've been up here all day and we'll need rest. When I get back up here, you go down and get some rest.
Yes, sir. I'll keep on course till you get back.
Afterwards, John could hear the captain start walking down the stairs at the side of the deck. John started to panic in fear that the captain would find him, and quickly shoved himself in a corner near the doorway in an attempt to hide himself. When the captain reached the bottom of the stairs, John could see him much more clearly now. He had a mid-length gray beard and wore a worn-down, battered leather hat and jacket. a large blue and red feather sticking up from the hat. John retreated further into the corner, pressing himself as tightly as he could into the pocket, now to try and not be seen by the captain. When the captain got closer to the door, he stopped. John was starting to panic internally, hoping he wouldn't be seen. In a flash, the captain reached forward and ripped John from his hiding place, throwing him to the floor. He pulled out his flintlock and pointed it at John.
Who are you, and what are you doing on my ship, boy?
I just wanted to see what the sea was like. I wanted to leave my town.
John replied, terrified of what might happen now that he was found.
You mean to tell me that you've been on my ship for 3 days without being seen?
The captain asked, still angry.
Yes, sir, yes. I snuck aboard the night you were on land getting supplies.
John mumbled in response. At hearing this information, the captain grabbed John by the arm and dragged him across the deck towards the edge of the ship. From the upper deck, they could hear the navigator call out to the captain.
What's going on, Captain? Who is that?
Just some forgotten cargo is all. Don't mind it for now.
Aye, sir. Will do.
The captain hung John over the edge of the ship and yelled.
Is this how you wanted to see the ocean, boy? Well, here you go. Have a good long look.
John squirmed and cried in the captain's grasp, wishing that the captain wouldn't throw him completely over the edge. Before he could have another thought, he was thrown back onto the deck and dragged back towards the mast, where the captain bound John's arms around the thick wooden pole.
I'll get back to you in the morning,
The captain told him coldly. He then yelled back up to the man on the upper deck.
Watch him for a while, will you? I gotta go talk to Juno like we planned.
Aye, Captain. Will do.
The man hastily replied, and the captain disappeared back through the door and down the stairs. Soon after, John passed out, whether it be from lack of food or not having been used to the ocean air that was making him nauseous. John awoke to a cold bucket of water being thrown on him, startling him awake. He was surrounded by what looked like about 20 people. The crew, he assumed, and the captain standing in the middle, with them holding a now empty bucket he had just used to wake John up. The captain loudly pronounced to the crew around him.
Does anyone here recognize this young lad? Anyone care to tell me how he may have gotten on my ship without being seen?
The crew around him mumbled and groaned softly, knowing that they were in trouble. The captain spoke up once again.
Oh, so nobody does? Well, that's too easy then. All of you, you'll be cleaning this deck till sunset, and I better not find a single plank untouched.
This was followed by more groans from the crew who had started to disperse.
Juno!
The captain spoke up again, speaking to one crew member in particular.
Yes, sir.
Replied a heavy-set man with long tapered hair and a neatly trimmed beard. John recognized him as the man that he first saw in the cargo area that he assumed was the quartermaster.
You remember what we said last night? He's under your command now since it was your supply he stowed away in for the last 4 days.
Yes, sir. I understand.
Replied Juno with his thick, watery tone. Juno then walked over to John and untied him, telling John to follow him downstairs. It was under Juno's command that John worked for the next year, cleaning, cooking, organizing, and stocking. Juno was the cook and quartermaster for the ship. Any and all supplies on the ship went through him. Most of the skills John learned on the ship were through Juno. John's second year on the ship, he was put under the command of Harris, the navigator of the ship. This was the man John had first heard the captain talking to when he had first stepped foot on the deck that one night so long ago. Harris was a lot more nice to John than Juno was. Where Juno was always forcing John to clean and would always get angry whenever John made a mistake, Harris would calmly correct John whenever he did something wrong. It was during the second year with Harris that John learned about how to properly tie knots, secure supplies to the deck, and how to properly navigate. Occasionally, John would get to steer the ship under the guidance of Harris and the captain. On John's third year on the ship, which by now he knew the name quite well, The Dark Wretch was the ship's name. The ship appeared only in the night, and it was during the 3rd year that John was given the official job of Crow's Nest Lookout. Scavenger ships were starting to become a bigger problem, and the captain felt John would be good for the position. John was in charge of spotting any potential threats on the water. He did occasionally get to see another ship off in the distance during this time, but never a ship that came close to causing him harm. It was one late night when he was working. He was tired from some chores he had done earlier in the day before coming up to the crow's nest. He was so tired he could barely stay awake properly. He eventually fell asleep at the top of that mast, and it was during this sleep that the ship was ambushed. He awoke to the sound of screams from below and the smell of the fire as the ship had been burning. He looked over the edge of the crow's nest basket and saw bodies littering the deck, their bloodstains on the boards below. He saw the fire that had been started on the upper deck and was quickly spreading. At the edge of the ship, he saw something that made his heart sink. It was the captain. The man that had spared John and kept him aboard the ship for the last 3 years. He was being held at gunpoint, forcing him over the edge of the ship. John couldn't react, couldn't call out. He was still too stunned to speak. The last thing he saw was a flash and a loud blasting sound as the captain was shot in the chest, flinging him overboard. John pulled himself back into the crow's nest, fighting back tears, knowing that this was all his fault. If he had just been awake to alert the crew, none of this would have happened. He peeked once more over the edge of the platform and saw that the opposing crew was getting back onto their ship and leaving. The fire had now reached the lower deck and was covering the entrance to the ship's inside. That didn't matter much to John. Almost everything he owned was on his person. His knife, his telescope, and a small flintlock that the captain had given to him when he took the lookout position.
To warn the crew,
He had said. So much for that now, John thought. John saw at the edge of the ship still hung a lifeboat, and as quickly as possible he made his way down the shroud that hung from the mast to the edge of the ship, eventually reaching the lifeboat and slowly lowering himself into the water. As he was rowing away, he could only watch as the fire spread over the last bits of the deck, slowly eating away at the ship. Eventually the mainmast fell down and brought the ship down with it, slowly sinking into the dark, cold abyss. John was alone now. More alone than he's ever felt. The more he rowed, the further he felt from the crew. The worse he felt about abandoning them. He was so lost in thought that he didn't even notice that a thick, heavy fog was setting in. So thick that he eventually couldn't even see right in front of him. Through the fog, a figure appeared sitting on the other end of the lifeboat. Once John noticed, he jumped back and immediately raised his gun and fired a single shot at the figure. The figure did not move, and the silence was almost deafening. Through the fog, John heard the figure speak, the voice old and ragged, waterlogged as if the man's lungs were filled with water themselves.
that's all you can do, boy.
The figure asked with anger in his tone. The fog cleared just enough for John to now see him clearly. The figure resembled a man in his mid-30s, wearing a captain's outfit similar to the captain of the Dark Wretch. Looking more closely at the man, John could see that his skin was decayed and his eyes were dead and gray. A small hole could be seen where the man's chest, where John had shot him. John sat in fear, the same fear he felt when he was trying to hide from the captain on that night over 3 years ago. Once again, the figure sneered and asked,
That's all you got then? What a weak, pathetic coward you are.
John sat back up and focused on answering back.
Who are you?
To which the figure replied, quite angrily,
You know who I am, boy. And you know why I'm here. You are a coward. A pathetic, worthless coward.
The figure quickly reached out to John and pulled him close by the cuff of his coat. John could now see much more closely the decaying gray flesh on the man's face, and his soulless eyes looking right into John's.
But I can change that.
The figure told him, and tossed John onto his back on the other end of the boat.
Oh, what do you mean? I can't change what I did. I know what I did was terrible. I know. I should have been awake to save them.
John replied, the sorrow he felt clearly showing through.
I'll make you a deal then. I'll give you that chance to save them. And in return, all I ask is that you serve under me for a while.
The figure coldly stated, staring back at John.
So, my suspicions are correct. You're Captain Hendrik, the captain of the Dutchman.
And as he said the name, he could see a faint, ghoulish glow of a ship behind the man. Captain Hendrik then replied,
A clever one you are, but a coward all the same, unless you choose to change your fate.
What exactly is this deal then?
John called back.
I will give you two choices. Option 1. Live as the coward you are, and forget about what happened here. Or, Option 2. Die as a hero, and save the crew you left behind. You have until sunrise to decide.
And in a flash, the figure disappeared, and the thick fog dissipated, leaving John all alone again. In the distance, John could see the lights of a town on land, and he rowed to the dock, not caring to tie the small boat up. He immediately went to the closest pub in town and ordered some ale, almost drowning himself in it. The pub keep eventually chimed in.
Rough night, huh?
John kept his head down and thought for a bit.
I'll be fine. I just need something to drink, is all.
Want to talk about it? It's a slow night, and I could use someone to talk to.
The pub keep replied, her voice calming John.
It's just that I think I may have lost everything. I was given the choice to change it, but I don't know if I have the strength to do so.
John answered back, the sorrow once again filling his voice.
Given a second chance to save a loved one at the cost of your own life, would you?
John asked her, looking up towards her now. She hesitated for a moment, not exactly knowing what John was talking about, but eventually answered the best way she could.
The people you love are what brings you the most joy in life. They're what makes us whole. I know if I could trade places with someone I've lost, I would. Even if it was just for a moment. Just to see them one last time.
This answer brought a warmth to John's heart that gave him the strength to finally decide on his answer to the undead captain. He paid his tab and thanked the pubkeep before leaving back into the cold dark of the black night, back towards the beach where he had gotten onto the island. Tears formed in his eyes as he screamed into the dark abyss over the ocean.
I accept your deal! Take me and save them!
And no sooner than when John yelled those words, the same dark mist from earlier settled in and engulfed John, causing him to black out. John woke up again, back inside the basket of the crow's nest on the dark wretch.
What? Was I dreaming?
John asked himself, standing back up. When he peered into the distance, he saw it. A ship was anchored just about 200 meters away from theirs, barely visible through the fog. He could see smaller boats in between the two ships coming his way, and could see a couple had already made their way beside the ship. John did not panic, for he knew that this wasn't a dream he had. This was his second chance. His chance to save the crew, and be the hero. He raised his pistol, aiming at the nearest boat, and fired a single shot, hitting one of the men in the boat in the shoulder, causing him to scream out in pain. John started yelling to get the attention of the other crew members on the ship, and started climbing down the shroud he had once used to escape to the lifeboat. But this time, he was now climbing down to fight off the offending crew members. 3 men were on the ship by the time John reached the bottom. He ran to the first one, sticking his knife deep in the man's chest before he could get a chance to react. The second, he ran to and sliced across the back with his sword, causing the man to fall to the ground in pain. By the time he was getting to the third member, 6 more assailants had boarded the ship, but the crew of the Dark Reg had also made their way onto the deck, weapons raised. One of the boarding crew blew a loud horn, and all 7 of the remaining boarding crew grouped together towards the edge of the ship, edging their way towards the bow. As they were watching the group move away towards the bow, a loud booming sound could be heard in the distance, and the sound of splintering wood could be heard as cannonballs pierced into the ship, one after the other, until about 8 shots had been fired. In the chaos, the 7 men from before rushed forward in an attempt to catch the crew off guard again. Both crews suffered losses, but the attackers had finally been fought off. The last crew member of the attacking party standing by themselves at the bow of the ship. The captain of the Dark Reg approached him.
Swell night for a right fight, eh?
The captain said, mocking this last assailant on his ship. And at that, the assailant pulled a pistol from his coat and raised it to the captain. Time seemed to almost slow down as John saw the pistol raise. He ran to stand in front of the captain and take the shot. The gun fired and hit John in the chest, protecting the captain. The moment John got shot was the moment the crew rushed in and restrained the last attacker. The next day, a funeral was held for the fallen crew members. 4 crew members died in total, 2 from the cannon volley, 1 from the fight with the crew, and then John himself, the hero who saved the crew, and more importantly, took a fatal shot for the captain of the Dark Reg. John stood as a ghost of himself, watching the crew have the memorial service for him. Juno placing the knife John had used to kill the first attacker. Harris placing a map showing directions back to the town that they had accidentally gotten John from 3 years ago. And finally, the captain who placed his hat upon John's head. In the captain's mind, John was more worthy of it at this point than he was. If it wasn't for John, he wouldn't even be alive. The captain stood in front of the remaining crew and made an announcement.
We gather here today to honor the brave men who gave their lives for this ship, whose bravery pushed past their fears, whose lives will never be forgotten. I wouldn't be standing here with you all if it wasn't for our newest member. I welcome you all to come and mourn the loss of these great men.
And upon the captain's final words, the crew stepped forward, all leaving behind various trinkets and treasures for the dead.
May they rest, knowing they served their cause.
The captain finally ended, tears now streaming from his eyes. John watched all this from the upper deck. He knew now that he had made the right decision. Behind him stood the man from before, Captain Hendrick, who said,
You've had your fun. Now come along. Your time on my ship starts now.
And John reluctantly turned around and followed the man, both disappearing into a thick black fog. While serving under his new captain through the years, John worked as a disciple of death, boarding ships and collecting the souls of the recently deceased for all eternity as payment for having a second chance. Thank you for being here for another story from Beyond Death's Gate. Please subscribe if you're not already, and be sure to hit the bell icon so you don't miss out on any future stories.